Going live. We're live. How are you guys doing?
Did you say that you're live or live?
Could be both at the same time.
Could be both at the same time. I don't know anymore. As the hair grows longer, my brain kind of slips more and more into those states where I didn't worry about such things.
I'm not doing so. I didn't sleep all that well last night. I have a bit of a headache, and I've had a continuous series of meetings for going on 4 hours now. So I'm going to be even duller than normal.
Oh, no. You are not. You're the one who pulls us through, Dave. Come on. You're our anchor. You are our bastion of sanity in the midst of.
We're doomed.
We're doomed.
Let's just got the whole thing down now.
Right. Allison, what are you up to?
Everything. Today's been a busy day. I've also had a lot of meetings. Not quite as many. I think I've only had 3, but still a lot of back-to-back meetings with 20 minutes in between to get absolutely nothing done. Been one of those days.
In other words, they're starting to figure out how to make working from home as inefficient as working in the office.
That. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that defeats the purpose. I mean, come on. The whole fun thing about this was being able to get as much done as you would in a normal day, but having it only take you 3 hours. Come on, give me a break. I heard Dave's stories about reorganizing 30 years or 40 years worth of astronomy magazine stuff in his garage or basement or whatever. And
I'd say in about another month, I'm going to have to take this camera down and give you a live tour of the basement. It's getting so clean now. Yes.
I will not do that in my garage.
I miss being able to store things like paper in my garage. You can do that in Arizona. You can't do that in Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah.
In Wisconsin, you just put it in a plastic bag, right?
Depends on how big the plastic bag is.
And then it's nice and cold, and so it's like having it in the deep freeze, and it.
Oh, until it gets really hot and humid.
And
then it's like putting it in, a shower.
It's hot now. It's the middle of May. It's up into the 40s today. It's a heat wave.
Don't give me that. Don't give me that. Okay, so where to dive in? We were talking about, you hear a lot about people saying, "Oh, we're going to figure out how bad this thing is by counting dead people," and we've talked about how hard it is to count dead people, and it shouldn't be that hard to count dead people, but it is for lots of reasons that we'll talk about. But this whole notion of, gee, if you recover, then that means it's all okay, is kind of a strange notion. So now I will look at you, Dave. Is your experience in life that when something goes really, 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 really bad, that at the end of it, the fact that at least you're still alive meant that everything was just perfectly fine?
No, I will admit there's a certain satisfaction to survival, but no, it means no such thing. It means that you barely hung on, perhaps, and you got maybe a little lucky. So no, the thinking there does not make good sense. And I'd just like to ask a quick quiz with this, because I've been asking people this all day. How many people do you know who have been tested for this thus far?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I live in Arizona, and Arizona is 51st out of 50 in terms of testing.
I would believe that.
With 50 states and the District of Columbia, we are absolutely dead last in terms of the fraction of our population that has been tested. And so I figure, I figure that if I get COVID and it happens to kill me by making my brain explode or something, instead of being just a really traditional pneumonia kind of thing, then I'm dead on the floor, and they say, "Oh, that's interesting. He was over 60. That must be natural causes." And, nobody's ever the wiser. It makes it good if you're actually trying not to count dead people or not to count COVID deaths, I suppose. But so no, testing is just not a thing here. We're not doing that.
And I know one person who has been tested for antibodies.
Well, that's one more
that's
person
one.
than I've heard from anybody I've talked to in the last 2 weeks. You're the winner, Allison.
Yes. My sister is very proactive. I
That
can't
makes it-
guarantee that my stepmother, who is a doctor, has not been tested, but I don't think she has been because she's mostly been working from home. So
Well, your count of one makes the sum aggregate from everyone I've talked to over the last month, a sum aggregate of one.
Oh, but that's because we don't work in the White House.
Ah, okay.
or they're testing every day.
So
Everyone.
where they're testing every day, I think
Clearly,
it's
that's not a
really,
problem there.
this business of, oh yes, the meat packing plants and all of these essential, boy, you have to remain open, and we're going to force you to remain open, and we know that it's not safe there and people are dying, but we're not going to tell you how many people are sick or dying because that's a corporate decision. We're going to leave that up to them. And so people go in and no, you can't stay home because we're going to take away all of your benefits if you do stay home. And we're not going to do anything to make it safer. None of that. You're just supposed to go in there where hundreds of people have already died and keep doing what you do until somebody comes down with it in the White House. And man, somebody comes down with it in the White House. And they're testing everybody. They're now testing every day. Everybody, every day is what I am given to understand. And, okay, the people who know what they're doing, the medical folk are quarantining. And I guess that Trump had a complete conniption, just went batshit, that somehow they let the virus get that close to him personally.
Wait a minute. Is that a technical term?
Conniption or batshit?
Batshit.
Batshit. Oh, batshit is very definitely a technical term. Yeah.
Very
Okay, I just wanted to interject. I don't want to interrupt you, but on the meat packing plants, that's important because the supply of Big Macs needs to continue to Pennsylvania Avenue there. So anyway, continue.
Okay. All right. But it's this crazy thing. The phrase where I grew up was, good for the goose is good for the gander. That's just not the case here. If you are, in fact, Allison, do you remember there was some governor, I forget which governor, that was talking about the meat packing plants and sort of made a comment along the lines of, oh, but it's the normal people can quarantine. Those are the people who work in the meat packing plants. Did you hear that?
I don't think I heard that. No.
Oh, it was, I can't, I feel bad that I can't actually put a name beside that at this point, but it's like, oh,
I'm sure
come
we
on,
can find one.
give me a break. So one dies or one doesn't. And maybe you know that you died from COVID. Maybe you don't know that you died from COVID. Lots and lots of people are dying anyway. But you survive. Where does that leave you?
I think the problem is that it really depends. It could leave you just fine, or it could leave you very impaired, probably for life, in terms of, say lung capacity or with heart issues or having had a stroke or, any number of things, or with kidney issues. I think those are kind of the big ones, it seems like.
Well, the thing, they have been calling this, there's an established thing, ARDS, which is, what is it? Acute respiratory distress syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. SARS was, what was it? Serious acute respiratory. Anyway, ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And which is a thing that gets triggered. And there are lots of people who know about that. And so ARDS is a thing that we do kind of know about. And ARDS is kind of nasty downstream. You come back a couple of years later and people have significant cognitive disabilities because of various things, including the fact that their brain was deprived of enough oxygen for extended periods of time. They have tremendous amount of weakness. They have lasting lung damage. They have, just all manner of morbidities. And I think that counts. Another thing that people have talked about is, oh, gee, this only kills old people. So that's who it has an effect on. That's another thing that the statistics belie. I was reading an article today that was actually looking at the age statistics of COVID deaths versus everything else. And in terms of its impact, if you throw out things like automobile accidents and, getting shot by a Trumpist and whatever, then the age distribution of COVID killing you is about the same as the age distribution of any other internal processes that kill you. And so this business of, oh, AIDS patients, this is just taking out the old, is a little bit like saying, oh, the flu just takes out the old, and cancer just takes out the old, and kidney disease just takes out the old, and so on and so forth. Some other interesting statistics that are kicking around out there. There was a group, maybe I want to say it was a group out of England, and I can't tell you exactly what group it was right now. But again, they were looking at the statistics, and they came to the conclusion that the typical COVID patient who dies would have lived for another something like 10 to 13 years. And so this idea that COVID is only picking off the old people who were about to die anyway is completely absurd. And it's that's one that kind of bugs me, in part because, damn it, I turn 62 years old tomorrow. And so I am now squarely in that age bracket of people who get to die from this. So anyway,
62 is the new 14. That's what they tell me.
I think that probably, judging by mental capacity, 62 is the new 3. But anyway,
remember that. And secondly, we've talked about this a little bit before. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know about this yet. And remember, this inflammatory disease now that children in New York are getting, that has led in some cases to cardiac arrest, and it's clear now that this virus, which manifests itself predominantly in the respiratory tract, also can in many other ways throughout the body, and it's really unpredictable. We don't know how this thing gets going and supercharges this terrible immune response. So I think there are a lot of ways. If you are a survivor, there's a lot of damage potentially with all kinds of systems in the body that we don't know about. We can't predict what people might be living with who do survive, even, from this.
Well, yeah, I think that's the point, that
Yep.
You can look at this and say, all right, one thing that we do kind of know about is what happens long-term with ARDS.
Mm-hmm.
And so, all right, one thing that this virus, there was a great, reading an article that made the comment that COVID attacks as a respiratory virus and kills as a cardiovascular virus. And so we still don't even really understand what's going on with this thing. I mean, you follow it, and even the treatment protocols that are being recommended are changing on a regular basis. Although there's some really cool statistics that goes into that, and don't get me started or I'll start talking about using Bayesian statistics to replace the double-blind test protocols and how no, I won't go there right now. Anyway,
that's another lesson, another lecture.
That's another one. If we get to the point that we've developed an audience that we can sit here and start talking about how you can use Bayesian statistics to, and then if we can take that and go ahead and now let's go beyond the Bayesian statistics and start talking about constructing the causal networks that if we can develop an audience that lets us do that, there will only be 3 people listening to us. So we'd probably better not. Oh, but anyway, it again, we know the kinds of things that ARDS does long term. Um, and so we know, and they're bad. We're going to talk, I think, in a couple of days about the mental health aspects of this, and certainly, ARDS does horrible things to people's mental condition downstream. But the thing about COVID is that ARDS seems like, I'm not a doctor, but as I read the literature, people talk about it as if, okay, ARDS is sort of the baseline, that everything that happens with ARDS is likely to happen if you get COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Except there's all of this other wonderful stuff it does. Like it gets into your brain and it does bizarre things, and it does bizarre things throughout your blood vessels. And they're starting to run out of not just respirators, but dialysis machines, because it turns out this thing attacks the kidneys. This business with young people that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talk about the long-term, okay, you've survived it, what are your long-term consequences are going to be?
Mm-hmm.
You can look at acute respiratory distress syndrome and say, well, that's kind of a baseline of what your long-term consequences might be. And when you look at it, ARDS is really crummy. I mean, it's something that sticks with you for years and years, and
Mm-hmm.
likely reduces your lifespan, and a dramatic decrease in quality of life, and so on and so forth. But then there's all of this other stuff on top of it, and we just don't know.
And I think the disturbing thing is, Allison, we're starting to find out that this is a terribly efficient and systematic, it's an all systems employer, this virus. It can latch on and take effect, as you mentioned, Jeff, in the bloodstream. It goes everywhere, and it's deviously efficient, unfortunately. I think we're starting to find out.
Yeah, as far as viruses go, it knows what it's doing, and it's doing it very well. And I think one unique thing to this too is, and again, not to compare this to the flu or a cold, but if you wanted to, you could say, you get the flu, you get a cold, you do recover, and you're fine. Generally, there are no major complications with that, that I'm aware of anyway. And most people don't worry about them. With this, it's very different. It's not just getting a cold or just getting a flu. Maybe you will get over it, but again, there's so much that we don't know that you may not get over it. You might have these complications that are going to last for years or the rest of your life, and it's not the same thing. It's not like getting the flu. And I think, again, that's not something that's on people's minds necessarily. And I mean, partly, again, we're just finding out about this now. The road to recovery is extremely long. As we kind of talked about before the show, a lot of people that have gotten this, that have recovered, it's taken them weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks. That's, months to actually be able to go up a flight of stairs, or to be able to make it to the bathroom on their own, or hold a conversation. That's definitely nothing like the flu or a cold. So it's very, very different. Much more, again, it attacks the whole body. It's very different.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too that early on in this, people were looking at it and they were pointing to the other coronaviruses. They were pointing to SARS, they were pointing to MERS, and saying, "Oh, well, gee, those are more deadly, and so those are the bad ones." The reality, of course, is that no, those weren't the bad ones, because they were deadly enough that they were easy to contain. This is the bad one. This is the one that's found the sweet spot.
Right.
And the other thing is that you look back at those, we don't know really what SARS did. We don't know really what MERS did in these respects, because there were so few cases.
That's right.
I mean, yeah.
And the scary thing here is that this can linger and re-emerge and sustain itself for a long, long time. If you look at the extreme end of the deadliness spectrum, Ebola killed almost everyone who came into close contact with people who were carriers. And in that sense, it was too deadly a virus from the virus's standpoint. It killed everyone and it flamed out. This one can go on for a long, long, long time in various stages of infection and groups without having that kind of mortality. So it actually makes the thing far more dangerous to a far larger population, a far larger herd, if you will. Don't you think so?
Yeah, no, I think with something that with, a much more deadly disease, yeah, you either get it and die, or, or there haven't been enough cases that we don't necessarily have the follow-up information because there just weren't enough people that recovered.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
kind of, again, this really is that sweet spot where you have a lot of
Yeah.
people getting it, at least some, significant fraction of them recovering. And again, we don't know what's going to happen, if I guess what I kind of worry about is, say immunity doesn't last. So you get it again. What if it's, way worse the second time? Or what if you have much more, complications coming out of it the second time? I mean, that's all speculation. Of course, we don't know
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
But, it's something to worry about. It's something to consider.
And it's
Yeah.
speculative. It's worrisome, although it's speculative. It's not unreasonable to think that it might. And so that implies that maybe we will need multiple doses of vaccinations, which again gets you to a point of how do you produce that much vaccine, even if you can
Yeah.
derive one.
Yeah.
You know,
I
there-
mean,
there-
those are we're now though far enough out on a limb that
Yeah.
we're now just out
Yeah,
into the
we're just
territory of
speculating at this
we
point.
don't know.
Right.
This is
Sure.
we can construct all manner of scenarios. We don't have to construct those scenarios though to look at it and say this is a serious thing and we're doing really, really dumb stuff imagining that we can open.
But we do have one
Yeah.
person identified who's been tested, though. That's progress.
One who was at least negative at the time of testing with an 80% chance of that being correct. So,
Well, actually, we've got comments. We've got
oh, we've got plenty of comments.
comment that somebody knows two people who were older and were in the hospital anyway and were tested, and
Hmm.
so we're up to maybe three.
Well, that's
And those are actual COVID
percentage
tests, whereas,
wise.
Yeah.
again, not the antibody test.
Yeah. And Jerry's asking, what is the brain effect reference? I haven't seen that. I will find some references and post. It's been showing up a lot of late, actually. The cognitive stuff is not surprising given ARDS, because if you just look at the long-term consequences of ARDS, cognitive reduction is the thing that people understand about.
Well, I think it's
And
just the
this-
long-term consequences of depriving the brain of oxygen of
Yeah,
any level for any period
yeah,
of time.
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of there's dementia that actually can be
Yeah.
caused by respiratory problems, and as soon as you clear up the respiratory problems, the
Yeah.
dementia goes away. So
yeah.
that would be my
Oh,
guess anyway.
And that leads off also into, well, again, we'll talk next week about the mental health aspect of all of this, but
Yeah.
you get into the business of having someone who is in the ICU without being able to have their family present. They're having to change protocols. I was reading about that they had really moved in the direction of saying that proper ICU protocols are to not overly sedate people and to keep them upright and as active as they can be, and so on and so forth. But given the overwhelm of ICU units during COVID, and also just the overhead of what you have to deal with somebody has this kind of an infectious disease, they're having to fall back on earlier protocols that they know are not good. So they're having patients suffer from, there's a form of dementia that specifically, an
Yes, the ICU, yeah.
ICU related dementia that crops up.
And there's PTSD very also tied to that as well.
Very
I mean,
serious
after the fact,
PTSD.
but yeah.
But even going to the kind of cool science of all of this stuff, that one of the things that doctors are seeing with this is they're measuring people's blood oxygen levels, and they're finding them, gee, you shouldn't be awake, much less active. And these people are saying, no, 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 give me a minute longer because I'm texting somebody on my cell phone.
Right.
And
It's a
so
subset of people, but it's really interesting.
yeah. And so it's just
Happy hypoxia is I think what they keep calling
Mm.
it. I think that's what they've been calling it.
Yeah.
It's really strange.
happy
I
hypoxia.
wonder, and again, I realize there has been no study on this, but some people handle, elevation better than others, and I'm wondering if it's somehow maybe those people would have handled elevation better. I have no idea. That's just
I
me
don't know.
speculating
Yeah.
literally right now.
That's
but
interesting.
Yeah.
I've also wondered, and again, this is complete speculation. I don't know a damn thing about it, but that normally you're not really all that sensitive to hypoxia. Normally, what you're sensitive to is an overconcentration of CO2,
Mm.
which is why people can walk into oil drums or oil storage facilities and things like that. They'll use nitrogen to flush those out.
Mm-hmm.
And every now and then you'll hear about somebody walking into one of those and just walking around until they fall down on the floor and die because your body tells you that you've got too much CO2. It doesn't tell you that you don't have enough oxygen. And so I kind of wonder, is there something, again, complete speculation, but is there something going on with how this thing is affecting the mechanisms that let you sense the fact that you've got too much CO2? I don't know, but it's fascinating stuff.
And it's certainly feasible. It could be
Yeah.
effective. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do remember early on there was, I don't know if I want to say study, but there was some kind of article that I read about some hospitals wanting to treat this like being at too high an elevation, and people who specialized in that kind of stepped in and said, actually, no, that's not the way to treat this. But it was a thought for a while, is do we treat this just like high elevation, sickness, altitude sickness?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think they figured that was not the case, but I think, it was an attempt.
Mm.
So we're in this kind of strange moment. And it's really, every now and then in this thing, I find that I just kind of have to step back and appreciate is kind of the wrong word, but just sort of step back and appreciate that right now we are in the middle of the greatest pandemic in the last century. That we are at that moment where the death rates are as high as they have been so far, and they're continuing to go up. People look at it, and it's still the case that only a tiny fraction of the number of people in the US have actually been exposed, have actually had it, which means that if you look at the growth curve on an epidemic, we're not way up here getting ready to peak. We're still down here at that point where things are starting to cruise upward in terms of the potential. And the only thing that we know about this is that it keeps acting differently than everybody thinks it ought to act. I want this to be one of the books that, you're reading the book and you just can't. I want to be able to flip to the last page. I want to be able to read the last page of the book, find out what all these answers are, so that then I can come back and kind of, all right, let's enjoy the ride. And enjoy is the wrong word. Let's appreciate the ride, at least knowing who survives to the end of it and what the answers are to some of this bizarreness. And
we're at the point in Apollo 13 when the oxygen tank exploded, not when they made it home.
Yeah.
You know what? I am really, really glad that Pence was not in charge of the team that was responding to the oxygen tank explosion on Apollo 13. I'm just real. What would they have done? Would they have, taken the three of them and kind of propped their frozen bodies up in front of the White House and declared it to be a great success? I don't know. Anyway,
it is a caustic combination of factors that we have now still existing on May 11th at this point in time. And I went out and did I went to Home Depot yesterday and picked up a bunch of stuff, and there were a lot of people walking around with no mask and acting as if they didn't give a damn about any of this crap and they wanted their lives to get back. And
Why? Do you have any sense at all as to where people are coming from with that attitude?
I think they kind of think that if they act like nothing's happening, then nothing will happen, would be my thought. Or again, it doesn't seem so scary now that you've been quarantined for a month and you're not sick. I don't know. I think it's easy to feel safe when you've at least done something and
Yeah,
it still hasn't touched you.
yeah.
That's my
I
guess.
think
I don't
people
know.
are impatient and they lack the maturity and the wisdom and the appreciation of the analysis of the science, and they reach a critical point where they say, this hasn't affected. I'm not sick. I don't really know anyone who's died. To hell with it. I'm going to go out. I've had it. That's the kind of sense I get from a lot of
Mhm.
people, and
Maybe it's just not so bad since no one
Yeah.
I know has actually died of it yet. Or
maybe what certain people are saying about it not being so bad and the recovery is going to be really quick is true.
Yeah, well, you go back 65 million years and you
Not to
can
the
just
science
sort of
portion.
imagine the dinosaurs looking there, watching the impactor coming in
Maybe
and
this
saying,
meteor is not going to be so bad after all.
Look, my
maybe,
favorite t-shirt, which I'm gonna buy someday, is this cute little dinosaur with the giant thing in the background and he's smiling, going, "Today is gonna be a great day." That's what I think of every time.
And God bless Hollywood, by the way, but this would have happened so quickly, you would not have
Yeah.
seen the meteor coming in toward you. It would have been blammo, you didn't know what hit you. Yep, the KT or KPG impact.
The KPG.
The Paleogene, now the geologists are insisting on tweaking the terminology again now of several of the epochs. So here we go again. If you're right up to the second now, it's the KPG impact, believe it or not.
Okay.
And 66 million years ago. So the nice thing about this, of course, is that among the survivors were these little guys. If you see these 13 lined ground squirrels, in your backyard that look like chipmunks, quote unquote, but they're little ground squirrels, something like that. They were the survivors 66 million years ago that led to us. The other good news is that fortunately, there are no other 10-kilometer diameter rocks out there in near Earth space. However, there are a lot of other smaller rocks that could be big trouble for us. And there are things that come in from farther out and so on. So there are dangers that are out there still that could give us another bad day that would make a pandemic look like nothing.
Well, yeah, they would make a pandemic look like nothing. We don't have to look that far to find the one that's going to make a pandemic look like nothing, though. Climate change isn't going to make a pandemic look like nothing, just hands down.
But
and we know that.
Well, wait a minute, though. Isn't the forward-looking, distant horizon of concern in this country about 12 and a half minutes after lunchtime?
No, I don't think they think that far forward.
Are we
It's,
supposed
Might be
to be
3.
able to think analytically about things that happen 5 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years from now? People, they don't think about things other than the moment, do they?
But we didn't evolve to think about those things. There were no evolutionary pressures to say your brain needs to be able to think about what happens if climate changes. There were no evolutionary pressures that said you need to think about what happens if there becomes so many of you that you completely overrun the planet. There were just evolutionary pressures to say, yes, make as many of you as you can. That was the evolutionary pressure right there.
Sounds like a virus.
Huh?
Sounds like a virus. Just saying.
Yes.
Destroy your host only so much so that most of you will die, but not all of you.
Well, the virus,
Except we haven't been through that part of the evolutionary
not there yet,
cycle.
yeah.
We're not, yeah, we haven't done the destroy your host.
We're moving at a
only-
slower pace.
We're
that's all.
moving at a slower pace.
right, the virus has two steps. It has invade something and then make as many of you as you can. Yeah, yeah.
Right, right. But again, if you look at it, and our brains evolved to deal with a very different world than the world that we live in.
Mm,
And so much of what we do just because obviously that's what we do, because living out on the tundra, that would have been a perfectly reasonable thing to do, by golly. And so we do it. And since it would be a shame to actually expect people to think harder about things than just accepting what comes naturally,
mhm.
they don't. But ultimately, if we keep just doing the things that our brains evolved to do, if we can, okay, we're going to make as many of us as we can, and I'm going to defend my group against all of the other groups. And if there's something there, I'm going to consume it, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
If we continue marching on this path where it is all about, yes, my power and my procreation and my whatever, then we're going to be the dinosaurs. It won't be it won't be an impact that takes us out. It will be us that takes us out.
Mhm.
And so the irony is that our long-term future depends upon our ability to actually use our intellect to learn to do things differently than evolution has prepared our brains to want to do things. And
Or
that may well be a losing proposition.
it may be,
Yeah.
because it's been a very long time that evolution
Yeah.
has driven us in this direction. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the Drake equation, and you talk about, why aren't they here yet?
It's a big place.
It's a big place, but also, again, completely wild speculation. And for this, we really do need beer or something. We're now heavy into the kind of conversation that one properly holds late at night over large quantities of some substance or other. Could it be that the problem with intelligent life in the universe is that all intelligent life, in an evolutionary sense, has to pass through a phase where they are so focused on procreation and immediate survival and those kinds of things, that process just necessarily builds intellects that are not suited for technological civilization? I don't know. I usually am fairly optimistic about this question, but suddenly I'm feeling very pessimistic about it.
Or for long-term planetary considerations.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, I
It's
think that's
very,
a reasonable question to ask.
yeah. Yep.
If only, I mean, hell, we're speculating about COVID, and the administration is doing such a good job of preventing us from having any real data about COVID that, speculating about COVID, speculating about life in the universe, that, we don't have test data for either, right?
Pretty much.
Nope. But we haven't run out of Big Macs yet.
But we
Not yet.
haven't run out of,
No.
Are you sure?
I
Are
admit
you
I haven't
sure
gone
we
to
haven't?
buy one recently.
That's what they tell me. Yeah.
Do we still have Big Macs?
Washington does.
Washington, I'm sure Washington
They still
does.
have COVID tests too, so.
Yeah, that's true. At least at 1600 Pennsylvania, they do. Yeah. I was reading an article where McDonald's workers in, where was it? Was it Denmark? They were talking to McDonald's workers, and they were talking about how sorry they felt for Americans who worked for McDonald's, because in their country, the government wouldn't let McDonald's treat them as badly during this thing as McDonald's treats their
think I read that.
workers here. Yeah.
Or something similar.
Yeah.
Hmm. Did they
Yeah.
make him eat the food here or what? No, I'm just kidding. Just joking. Okay.
Yeah, there are many ways to take that one. So yeah, recovery. Going back to the theme, the planet recovered. The dinosaur killer hit, and over millions of years, the planet recovered, and it gave rise to us. And we look around today and say, oh, we have to, here, isn't this wonderful? And to a certain extent, everything that we look at today is, well, not to a certain extent, everything that we look at today owes its existence to the devastation that came along with the
KBG, right?
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
I'm going to keep saying, I am old enough that, damn it, it's the KT impact. It's always going to be the KT impact, and I'm going to call it the KT impact. Okay.
Half the people I've ever talked to have said exactly the same thing.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
glad to hear
people's
it.
argument for calling Pluto a planet still, so I don't
Right.
know. I learned it was a planet in school, therefore I don't care what you call it.
No, but I mean,
Double-edged sword.
Anyway. But I don't know. I wonder sometimes, for us to be here, something had to kind of come along and wipe out what had been.
Mhm.
And it was painful at the time. It was exquisitely painful at the time.
Mhm.
And I wonder if, looking back on this from 40, 50, 200, 1,000 years in the future, people are going to look back on what's happening right now as the very, very painful event that had to happen to destroy what had been, so that something else could rise in its place. And a thing that people don't get, we're talking about, oh, it's time to start opening up again, and oh, we're past the peak. No, we're not. If you actually look at the numbers, a very small fraction of the population has had this thing. You look at the models, and we did a little bit to get it under control. An awful lot of that is because it ran wild in New York for a while, and that kind of made the overall numbers look funky. But we're early on in this thing, and it's going to get bad. And everybody that looks at it, the epidemiologists who look at it know it's going to get bad. And eventually, you look, for example, at schools. My wife, elementary school principal, if you look at schools, especially for young kids, elementary, junior high age kids, then what that means for most people is it means free childcare. Because you send your kids to school, because by sending your kids to school, that means that you get to go work.
Yep.
And the reason why everybody is so completely, oh, we've got to open the schools again, is because they're worried about kids learning things. It's because, oh, we've got to have free childcare so we can shoo people back into workplaces again.
Right.
As a result of that, one of the things that hasn't really made the news but should is that the CDC had put up really very detailed guidance about what you needed to do before you could open a school safely. And if you went down that, you realize that, yeah, there's not going to be such a thing as opening a school safely for a long, long time. Reading an article today that was talking about looking at the numbers. Catching the virus is all about concentration of viral particles times the amount of time that you're in close proximity to them.
Exposed.
And when you look at that, the worst place in the world for transmitting a virus like this is a school classroom, even if there are not very many kids in the classroom. But you have to open the schools, because by golly, if we don't open the schools, then we can't do this whole reopening thing. Ergo, it's safe to open the schools. And about the time that people started to realize this, I had been watching, and I didn't save the old page, and I wish that I had, but the CDC had posted guidelines on this is what it takes to open schools. These are the steps that you would need to do. And it talked about, behavior modification and need to have much, much lower concentrations of kids and need to have them not inside for any significant amount of time and need to completely rearrange things so that classes never encountered other classes, and that there needed to be multiple times a day, things needed to be wiped down, and there needed to be no physical contact between the kids or between kids and teachers, and so on and so forth. And this was a very perfectly honest experts in public health looking at it and saying, what would it mean to have a safe classroom with this thing kicking around the way it's kicking around? And this is what they described. And then we have to open, and we have to have the schools so that we can open. And I went back and I looked at that same page, and it was gone. And
Wow.
in its place, there was something that basically said, you need to put up some posters in the room to tell kids what symptoms of COVID look like. And you need to be sure that the janitors do a good job of washing the room at the end of the day. And kids probably ought to wash their hands. And it's like, what? This is out of the CDC. The CDC were supposed to be the good guys. The CDC were supposed to be the guys that you could turn to and say, all right, they're going to tell you the straight stuff. They're going to tell you what's really going on. They're going to tell you the real deal. And then you look, and when it became politically necessary to say, yes, we can open schools and not have to worry about all of this stuff, suddenly the CDC guidelines for what it takes to open schools changed.
So if it's not in September, will at some point too early schools open and become the petri dishes that they always are, but with this disease, because if they don't, the economy can't get cranked up again?
And then what's going to happen when this is one of those things where reality is going to have its way. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to open up schools. They're going to start shoveling people back in schools. They're going to pretend everything it's okay. They're going to tell people everything it's okay. They're probably going to play the same kinds of games on teachers that they have been playing on workers at meat packing plants, telling them either you get back into that classroom or we're going to take away, all of your everythings. And then people are going to start dying.
What happens when Jimmy Randolph all of a sudden is not in class because he's at Waukesha Memorial Hospital one morning? I mean, what happened?
Yeah. Or Ms. So-and-so doesn't come back and the sub has been here for 2 months. Or, you haven't seen Billy because he hasn't been able to come to school for 2 months because, his grandparents just died of this thing and his parents are sick.
Mm.
What's going to happen when it's not now just Trump out there saying, all right, you guys go and do this thing. Now it's people like members of school boards who actually now are part of their community and are making these decisions and are then seeing people die as a consequence of these decisions.
Mm.
And I think it's going to be very interesting, because when you run for a school board, or when you take a job as a district superintendent, or when you take a job as a teacher or a principal or whatever, you're not really figuring that you're signing up to start making life or death decisions on how you're going to handle putting people in situations where statistically you know that there are going to be deaths that result from your decisions. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about we are talking about those people being forced into positions where they have to make decisions that will kill people. What's that going to feel like? What's that going to do? How are they going to react?
We're going to find out.
We're going to find out. Anyway.
It's going to be daunting, and it's going to be in a darkly disturbing way, an unprecedented, uncharted territory that we're going to be.
Yeah.
It's going to be in some ways unthinkable. And maybe then, if these things happen, if this scenario happens, then the people who drive their red pickup truck up into the loading zone at Home Depot are not going to have that same cavalier, this is all a joke look on their face. Who knows? Maybe they still will, but we'll see.
Well, maybe they won't, maybe they will.
Yeah.
At some point though, I mean, I keep hoping is the wrong word. If you look at history and Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century did a really amazing job at looking at the history of capitalism. And what he pointed out was that what happens with capitalism historically is that because it is unstable, it does lots of things great, but it's also unstable. The way that you make money is you have money. And once you have money, it's almost impossible not to make more money. And so what capitalism
wait a minute, for certain billionaires, that's not been the case.
Well, unless you're so incompetent as
sorry,
I know. Right.
There are
Unless you are that incomprehensibly stupid, it is difficult if you have large piles of money not to continue making large piles of money. And if you think about if you think about what that means, is that what naturally happens in a capitalist system is wealth becomes more and more and more and more concentrated. And as that happens, eventually people who are on the short end of the stick, which is just about everybody, start to get annoyed about it. And, eventually they go and they storm the Bastille. And what Thomas Piketty, the argument that he makes is that if you look historically, that there is a cycle to that things become very, very concentrated until finally it breaks and you get revolution. You get something that happens that then tears that apart, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. The United States kind of went through that. Our last Gilded Age was in the early part of the 20th century, and there was World War I, and there was the Spanish flu, and there was the Great Depression, and there was World War II, and there were all of these things. But what happened during that period was that a lot of that stuff got adjusted so that the society that emerged from the back end of that actually did have wealth taxes, and actually did have actual progressive structure, and actually did have safety nets, and actually was putting resources into building infrastructure and those kinds of things.
But then came the last 60 years, though.
Then came, especially the last 40 years, but okay, I'll give you 60.
Yeah. The last roughly half century, let's say.
Yeah. Now, if you look at the numbers, it's the last 40 years.
Okay.
If you look at things, there are different things that you can look at. One of the things that you can look at is you can look at worker productivity and worker wages. And those things had been tracking each other, and wages went flat even as productivity was going up, coming up on 1980. Looking at when tax rates started to get sort of ridiculous, that happened around then.
Guessed.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He's listening.
Anyway, he's listening. I'll
No, this
I'll-
is
I will leave it. The point that I'm making is that if you look, and the argument that Piketty makes
Yeah.
is that if you look historically, what happens is that you get yourself in that the system gets itself in bad situations until something really bad happens. Something really bad happens involves, you know, John Q. Public finally getting fed up and you know, deciding to do something about it. And then you have to rebuild. And so you have to go through the crucible. And I think maybe what we're doing right now is we're going through the crucible. And maybe what's going to happen is it's going to have to get really, 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 really bad before it becomes possible to start asking these questions about how is it that we are distributing wealth, and about how are we valuing life as opposed to profits. You know, asking basic questions like is the economy here to serve us, or are we here to serve the economy? So yeah, we happen to be living, I think maybe I might, who knows, I don't know, but I'm guessing that maybe we're living at that moment where we are going to have to pass through that kind of a gateway, that kind of a crucible. That's why I want to be able to go to the end of the book and open it up and read the last page.
Right. It would be comforting.
Well, we haven't resolved everything, but we can continue again this Thursday.
Fantastic. All right.
Excellent.
Take care, everybody.
Good.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.
Be
Wear your
safe.
mask.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.